I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd walk away from her own son's dinner party with her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, but life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. My name is Patricia, Pat to anyone who's known me longer than a week, and I'm 63 years old. I've lived through a husband's death, raised a boy on my own, worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over our heads, and somehow, through all of that, I never once felt as small as I did the night my daughter-in-law looked around my home and said those words that would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really began, because revenge, real, satisfying revenge, isn't born in a single moment. It's cultivated over years of swallowed pride, silent humiliations, and the slow, burning realization that you've been treated like you're less than nothing by the people who should love you most. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world where family still matters, where respect for your elders isn't just a phrase but a practice, drop a comment below and tell me where you're from. I'd love to know I'm not alone in feeling what I felt. And if you've ever been made to feel invisible in your own life, stay with me. This story is for you. Before we dive deeper, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and check the description box below for more stories like this one, stories about women who refused to stay down when life tried to bury them. It was a warm September evening in Charleston, South Carolina, the kind where the air hangs heavy with humidity and the cicadas sing so loud you can barely hear yourself think. I'd driven 40 minutes from my little house in the suburbs to my son David's new place, a sprawling colonial revival in one of those gated communities where the lawns are so perfect they look painted on and the neighbors smile at you with teeth so white they could blind you. David had done well for himself. He was a financial analyst at a prestigious firm downtown, the kind of job that came with a company car and invitations to golf tournaments I'd never understand. I was proud of him. God knows I was proud. I'd scraped and saved and sacrificed so he could go to college, so he could have the life I never had. And he'd made it. He'd married a beautiful woman named Vivienne, a name that always made me think of old Hollywood, of women in fur coats and diamond earrings, and they lived in a house that could fit 3 of mine inside it. But pride, I've learned, can coexist with heartbreak. I pulled up to the circular driveway that evening and saw the cars already parked there. Sleek, expensive things with names I couldn't pronounce. A Tesla. A Range Rover. A Mercedes with plates that read success with 3 SS, like one wasn't enough to make the point. I drove a 2008 Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door from where I'd backed into a shopping cart at the grocery store. I didn't belong here, and I knew it the moment I stepped out of my car. The front door was open, music and laughter spilling out onto the porch. I smoothed down my dress, a floral print I'd bought on clearance at Belk's, and walked inside with a smile I'd practiced in the car. David met me in the foyer, and for a moment, just a moment, he was my little boy again. He hugged me, and I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that Vivienne probably picked out. "Mom, you made it," he said, pulling back to look at me. "Come on, everyone's out on the terrace." Everyone. That word made my stomach tighten. I didn't know these people, his friends from work, Vivienne's college sorority sisters, the couples they'd met at wine tastings and charity galas. I was a retired elementary school teacher who spent her weekends tending to a vegetable garden and watching reruns of British baking shows. What would I possibly have to say to them? But I followed David through the house, past the marble-topped island in the kitchen, past the living room with its vaulted ceilings and that chandelier that probably cost more than my annual property taxes. The terrace was lit with string lights, and a long table was set with china and crystal glasses that caught the fading sunlight like tiny prisms. There were maybe a dozen people there, all of them younger than me, all of them dressed in that effortless way that money buys, linen shirts, silk blouses, shoes that didn't come from a department store sale rack. Vivienne saw me and waved, her smile bright and perfect. She was 29, blonde, with the kind of bone structure that made you think of magazine covers. She'd grown up in Savannah, old money, the kind of family that had streets named after them. I'd always felt like she was doing David a favor by marrying him, and I hated myself for thinking that way. "Patricia, you're here," she called out, her voice carrying over the chatter. "Everyone, this is David's mom, Pat." A chorus of hellos and nice to meet yous followed. I smiled and nodded, taking the empty seat at the far end of the table that someone gestured to. A server, yes, they'd hired servers, poured me a glass of white wine, something crisp and cold that I sipped too quickly because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The conversation flowed around me like a river I couldn't step into. They talked about their jobs, their vacations to the Amalfi Coast and Turks and Caicos, their renovations and investments. I listened, nodding when it seemed appropriate, laughing when others laughed. I was a ghost at that table, present but unseen. And then Vivienne started talking about houses. You know, she said, leaning back in her chair with that confident ease she always had, David and I have been thinking about upgrading already. This place is nice, but it's not quite the statement we want to make. One of her friends, a woman named Bryn with a platinum bob and a laugh like wind chimes, leaned in. You two just moved in. What's wrong with this place? Vivienne waved a hand dismissively. Oh, nothing's wrong with it. It's just safe, you know? We want something with more character, more presence. David laughed, a little nervously, and I saw him glance at me. I kept my face neutral. Where would you even go from here? Asked one of the men, someone named Trevor who worked with David. This is already top tier. Vivienne shrugged. We're looking at properties in the historic district. Something with real history, not just new construction trying to look old. And then she said it. The thing that would burrow under my skin and fester there for weeks. I mean, can you imagine living in one of those little suburban houses? The ones with vinyl siding and chain-link fences. She laughed, and others joined in. David's mom has one of those places. I visited once, and I swear, it's so cramped. Like, you can hear everything from every room. I told David, I don't know how you grew up there. No offense, Pat, but it's just not for me. The table went quiet for half a second, and then the conversation moved on, as if she hadn't just sliced me open in front of everyone. I felt my face burn. I felt my hands tremble around the stem of my wine glass. I looked at David, waiting for him to say something, anything, to defend me, to tell her that house was where he learned to ride a bike, where I read him bedtime stories, where I held him when his father died. But he just smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. I don't remember much of the rest of that dinner. I know I stayed until dessert was served, some elaborate panna cotta with berry compote that I pushed around my plate. I know I excused myself early, claiming a headache, and that David walked me to my car with an apology in his eyes that he never voiced. As I drove home that night, the lights of Charleston blurring through my tears, I made a decision. I wouldn't be small anymore. I wouldn't be the joke, the embarrassment, the woman whose life wasn't impressive enough to matter. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to prove that I was worth something. That my life, my little house, my quiet existence, it all meant something. I just didn't know that the proof would come at a cost I hadn't imagined. My house wasn't much, but it was mine. That was something Vivienne would never understand because she'd never had to fight for anything in her life. Every brick, every shingle, every coat of paint on those vinyl-sided walls represented a sacrifice I'd made, a battle I'd won. And the fact that she could dismiss it so casually, so cruelly, in front of a table full of strangers, it burned in a way I couldn't shake. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed, the same bed I'd shared with my husband William for 15 years before cancer took him, and I stared at the ceiling fan making its lazy circles overhead. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the foundation settling, sounds I'd grown so used to they were like a heartbeat. This house had been our dream, William's and mine. We'd bought it when David was 3 years old, a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood where kids still played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. It wasn't fancy. The kitchen had laminate countertops and appliances I'd replaced one at a time as they broke down. The bathroom tiles were from the 70s, that avocado green that no one thought was ugly back then. The living room carpet had a stain from where David spilled grape juice when he was 7. But every inch of this place held memories. The backyard was where David learned to throw a baseball. The front porch was where William and I used to sit on summer evenings, drinking sweet tea and watching the fireflies come out. After William died, David was only 12, I thought about selling. The mortgage felt impossible on a teacher's salary. But I couldn't do it. This house was all David had left of his father. So I took on extra work. I tutored kids after school. I sold baked goods at the farmer's market on Saturdays. I cleaned houses on the weekends for families in the nicer neighborhoods, the ones with marble countertops and walk-in closets bigger than my bedroom. I wore my knees down to bone scrubbing other people's floors so I could keep the roof over my son's head. And I did it. I kept the house. I sent David to college. I watched him graduate, watched him get his first job, watched him become a man I could be proud of. And all the while, I thought he understood. I thought he knew what that house represented, not just walls and a roof, but love and sacrifice and survival. But sitting at that dinner table, Hearing Vivienne's laughter echo in my ears, I realized something devastating. David had grown ashamed of where he came from. Or maybe he'd always been ashamed, and I'd just been too blind to see it. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. Or maybe it was just anger masquerading as a plan. I didn't know yet. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit into their world while they pretended mine didn't exist. I made coffee, the cheap kind from the grocery store, not the artisan beans Vivienne probably bought from some boutique roastery, and sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook. I was a planner by nature. Years of teaching had taught me that. You can't control kids without a strategy, and you can't control your life without one either. I started making a list. What did I have? What did I want? What was I willing to do to get there? What I had, a paid-off house. A teacher's pension that wasn't much but was steady. Some savings I'd been hoarding for emergencies. A lifetime of skills people underestimated because I was old and quiet and not part of their shiny, successful world. What I wanted, respect. Not their approval, I was done begging for that, but respect. I wanted them to see me as someone who mattered, someone whose life had value beyond being David's mother or Vivienne's inconvenient relative. What I was willing to do, I didn't know yet. But I knew it had to be something big. Something that would make them look at me and realize they'd underestimated me all along. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been dismissed or overlooked, you know that moment when something inside you shifts. When you stop trying to be liked and start trying to be heard. That's where I was. And if you're feeling that way right now, I want you to do something for me. Leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me what you're fighting for. And then subscribe to this channel and check the description box below, because there are more stories like mine, stories about people who fought back and won. The problem was, I didn't have a clear path forward. I just had rage and determination, which is a dangerous combination without direction. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I started researching. I spent the next week on my laptop, the old Dell I'd bought refurbished 5 years ago, learning everything I could about real estate, investments, business ownership. I'd never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I was a teacher. My world was lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences and gold star stickers. But I was also stubborn, and I'd learned a long time ago that you don't need fancy credentials to figure things out. You just need time and willingness to look stupid while you learn. I found out that Charleston's real estate market was booming. People from up north were moving down in droves, buying up properties, renovating them, flipping them. The historic district Vivienne had mentioned, the one she and David were eyeing, was particularly hot. Houses that had been falling apart 10 years ago were now selling for millions after the right renovations. And then I found something interesting. There was a small property for sale on the outskirts of the historic district, a rundown Victorian that had been sitting on the market for months. It was a mess. The listing photos showed peeling paint, a sagging porch, overgrown weeds choking the yard. But it had good bones, as they say. And it was cheap. Well, cheap relative to everything else in that area. It was still more money than I'd ever spent on anything in my life besides my house. I shouldn't have even considered it. I was retired. I had no business taking on a project like that. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I imagined buying it, fixing it up, turning it into something beautiful. And then I imagined Vivienne's face when she found out. When she realized that the woman whose house she'd mocked had done something she'd only talked about. It was petty. I knew it was petty. But God, it felt good to imagine. I called the realtor listed on the property. Her name was Jolene, and she had that thick low country accent that made everything sound a little bit like a secret. We arranged to meet at the property the next day. The house was worse in person than it had been in the photos. The front steps creaked under my weight. The windows were so dirty I could barely see through them. Inside, the wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards were warped, and there was a smell, something musty and old, like the house itself was rotting from the inside out. But I stood in the middle of what had once been a grand parlor, with its high ceilings and ornate crown molding, and I saw potential. More than that, I saw revenge. This house could be spectacular. This house could be worth something. And if I was the one who made that happen, then maybe, just maybe, I could prove that I was worth something too. Jolene watched me with a mixture of skepticism and pity. "It's a lot of work, honey," she said. "You sure you're up for this?" I wasn't sure. But I nodded anyway. "How much?" She told me the price, and my stomach dropped. It would take almost all of my savings, plus a small loan. It was insane. It was reckless. It was everything I'd been taught not to do with money. But I thought about Vivienne's laugh. I thought about David's silence. I thought about all the years I'd played it safe, lived small, made myself convenient for everyone else. I'll take it, I said. Jolene's eyebrows shot up. You sure? Don't you want to think about it? Talk to your family. I smiled, and it felt like the first real smile I'd had in weeks. I'm sure. We shook hands, and as I walked out of that crumbling house into the bright South Carolina sun, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. This was either going to be the best decision I'd ever made or the worst. But at least it was mine. At least I was finally doing something. Buying the house was the easy part. Fixing it up was going to be the challenge that would either make me or break me. I knew that from the start, but knowledge and experience are two very different things. I learned that lesson the hard way over the next several months, with bruised knees, splinters in my hands, and more tears shed in empty rooms than I care to admit. I didn't tell David about the house. Not at first. I told myself it was because I wanted to surprise him, but the truth was more complicated than that. I was afraid. Afraid he'd try to talk me out of it. Afraid he'd think I was being foolish or impulsive. Afraid he'd tell Vivienne, and she'd laugh at me again, this time behind closed doors where I couldn't even defend myself. So I kept it secret. It became my project, my purpose, my obsession. The first step was figuring out what the hell I was doing. I'd never renovated anything in my life beyond painting a bedroom or replacing a leaky faucet. This was different. This was structural damage and electrical issues and plumbing that probably hadn't been updated since Eisenhower was president. I needed help, but I also didn't have the budget to hire the kind of contractors Vivienne would hire, the ones with websites and portfolios and prices that required a second mortgage. I started with YouTube. God bless the internet and all the people willing to teach you things for free. I watched videos on everything from how to patch drywall to how to strip old wallpaper without destroying the walls underneath. I took notes like I was back in college. I made lists of tools I'd need, materials I'd have to buy. I learned terms I'd never heard before: load-bearing walls, vapor barriers, sistering joists. My brain hurt, but I kept going. Then I started asking around. There was a hardware store near my house that I'd been going to for years, one of those local places where the guy behind the counter knew your name and could tell you exactly which aisle had the thing you needed before you even finished describing it. His name was Raymond, a black man in his 70s who'd worked in construction his whole life before retiring and taking the hardware store job to keep himself busy. I told him about my project one day while I was buying a crowbar and some work gloves. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "You bought the old Pritchard house?" I nodded. "You know it." "Everybody knows it, Pat. That place has been falling apart for 20 years. You got your work cut out for you." "I know." He studied me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating whether I was serious or just foolish. Finally, he said, "I might know some people who can help. Good workers, fair prices. They do quality work, not that quick-flip garbage that's gonna fall apart in 5 years. You interested?" I nearly hugged him. Yes. Absolutely. That's how I met Hector and his crew. Hector was in his 40s, a contractor who'd built a small but solid reputation in Charleston for honest work and reasonable rates. He wasn't flashy. He didn't have a website or a fancy truck. But when he walked through the Pritchard house with me, he didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. He just nodded, made notes on a clipboard, and gave me a quote that made my chest tighten but didn't feel completely impossible. "I can do it," he said. "But it's gonna take time. And you're gonna have to make some choices about what's priority and what can wait." "What would you prioritize?" I asked. "Foundation, roof, electrical, plumbing. In that order. Everything else is cosmetic, and you can live with cosmetic for a while. But if the bones aren't solid, nothing else matters." I hired him on the spot. For the next 3 months, I spent almost every day at that house. I'd wake up before dawn, make a thermos of coffee, and drive into the city while the roads were still quiet. I'd work alongside Hector's crew, hauling debris, sanding floors, painting walls. They were kind to me, those men. They didn't treat me like a burden or a nuisance. They taught me things. They let me help. And when I inevitably did something wrong, like the time I painted over a section of wall they were going to tear out the next day, they just laughed and moved on. I learned so much during those months. Not just about construction, but about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I thought, both physically and mentally. I learned that I could take a problem, a seemingly insurmountable problem, and break it down into smaller pieces until it felt manageable. I learned that I wasn't too old to start over, to try something new, to reinvent myself. But I also learned how lonely this kind of work could be. Because while I was pouring my heart into this project, life was going on without me. David called occasionally, but less often than before. He was busy with work, with Vivienne, with their life. He invited me to dinner once, but it was last minute, and I was covered in drywall dust and too exhausted to make the drive. I told him I wasn't feeling well, which was true enough. Vivienne never called. Not that I expected her to. But sometimes I'd see her posts on social media, pictures of their life, their trips, their friends. They looked so happy, so effortlessly perfect. And I'd look down at my paint-stained clothes and bandaged fingers and wonder what the hell I was doing. But then I'd walk into the house and see the progress. The new roof that didn't leak. The floors we'd sanded and refinished, bringing out the honey-colored oak underneath. The kitchen where we'd ripped out the old cabinets and were slowly rebuilding it into something functional and beautiful. And I'd remember why I was doing this. Not just to prove something to them, but to prove something to myself. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting golden light through the parlor windows, I stood in the middle of the room and let myself imagine what it would look like when it was done. I imagined furniture arranged just so, art on the walls, maybe a chandelier where the old water-stained fixture used to hang. I imagined inviting people over, not David and Vivienne, not yet, but friends, neighbors, people who would appreciate what I'd built. And for the first time since that awful dinner party, I felt something other than anger. I felt hope. Raymond stopped by one afternoon to drop off some supplies I'd ordered. He walked through the house slowly, taking everything in. When he came back outside to where I was sitting on the porch steps with a bottle of water, he shook his head. "You did good, Pat," he said. "Real good. This place is gonna be something special." "You think so?" "I know so. And I'll tell you something else, it takes guts to do what you're doing. A lot of people would have given up by now. But not you. You got fire in you." I laughed, a tired sound. "I don't know about fire. Most days I just feel stubborn." "Same thing," he said, and winked. After he left, I sat there on those porch steps as the sky turned pink and purple, and I let myself feel proud. Not of what the house would become, but of what I'd already done. I'd taken a risk. I'd learned new skills. I'd refused to let doubt or fear or age or anyone else's opinion stop me. And that was worth something, even if no one else ever knew about it. But they would know. I'd make sure of that. The time just wasn't right yet. I needed the house to be finished, or close enough to finished that it would make an impact. And then I'd invite David. I'd invite Vivienne. And I'd watch their faces when they realized what I'd accomplished. I know what you're thinking, that I was doing this for the wrong reasons, that revenge is a poison you drink yourself. Maybe you're right. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes you need something to fight against before you can figure out what you're fighting for. And that house, that beautiful, broken house, gave me something to believe in when I'd stopped believing in myself. If you've ever started something everyone doubted, a business, a dream, a second chance at life, leave a comment and tell me about it. Tell me what you built when people said you couldn't. And don't forget to check the description box below for more stories like this, stories about people who bet on themselves and won. By the time spring arrived, the house was transformed. Not completely finished, there were still rooms that needed paint, fixtures that needed updating, a garden that was more dirt than flowers, but it was close enough. Close enough that when you walked in the front door, you didn't see a disaster anymore. You saw potential realized. You saw beauty. I'd done things I never imagined I could do. With Hector's patient guidance, I'd learned to lay tile, to install light fixtures, to choose finishes that complemented the house's historic character without making it feel like a museum. The parlor now had a working fireplace we'd restored, the mantel stripped of decades of paint to reveal the original carved wood underneath. The kitchen had new cabinets I'd painted a soft sage green, with brass hardware and butcher block countertops I'd sanded and oiled myself until my shoulders ached. Upstairs, the bedrooms had fresh paint and refinished floors that gleamed in the afternoon light. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And it was magnificent. I'd also made a decision during those months of work, one that had crystallized slowly as I poured money and sweat into this place. I wasn't going to sell it. Not right away. Maybe not ever. Instead, I was going to turn it into a short-term rental. The historic district was full of tourists year-round, people looking for that authentic Charleston experience, willing to pay premium prices for a place with character and charm. I'd researched the market, worked with Jolene to understand the logistics, and even taken a weekend course on hospitality management at the community college. This wasn't just going to be a one-time victory. This was going to be a business. My business. Something that would generate income, give me purpose, and prove that I was more than just David's mother or Vivienne's inconvenient relative. But before I could open it to the public, there was something I needed to do. Something I'd been planning since the day I bought the place. I needed to invite David and Vivienne to see it. The thought made my stomach twist with nerves every time I considered it. What if they didn't care? What if Vivienne found some way to dismiss it, to make it seem small despite everything I'd accomplished? What if David looked at me with pity instead of pride? But I couldn't let fear stop me now. I'd come too far. I decided to host a small dinner party. Nothing as elaborate as the one they'd thrown. I didn't have servers or a terrace with string lights, but something nice. Intimate. I'd cook, something I was actually good at, and I'd show them what I'd built with my own hands and determination. I called David on a Thursday evening, my heart pounding so hard I thought he'd be able to hear it through the phone. "Hey, Mom," he answered, and I could hear the distraction in his voice. He was probably still at the office or on his way home, his mind a million miles away. "Hi, sweetheart. Do you have a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" I took a breath. "I want to invite you and Vivienne to dinner. At my place. Next Saturday evening, if you're free." There was a pause. "Your place? Mom, you know Vivienne and I are pretty busy. We've got that thing with—" "I know," I interrupted, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "I know you're busy. But this is important to me. Please, David. It's been so long since we spent time together, just the three of us." Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear him calculating how to say no politely. But then, to my surprise, he said, "Okay. Yeah, we can do that. Let me check with Viv, but I think we're free." Relief flooded through me so intensely I had to sit down. Thank you, David. Come around 7. 7 works. Should we bring anything? Just yourselves, I said, and we hung up. I spent the next week preparing like I was hosting royalty. I cleaned the house until it gleamed. I planned a menu, nothing too fancy, but elevated. Herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, a salad with goat cheese and candied pecans, and for dessert, a lemon tart because I knew it was David's favorite. I bought fresh flowers for the dining room table, white roses and eucalyptus that smelled like spring and new beginnings. And I practiced. God help me, I practiced what I would say, how I would tell them about the house, about what I'd done. I imagined their reactions, their questions, and I prepared my answers. I wanted to seem confident but not boastful, proud but not desperate for their approval. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that made the curtains dance in the open windows. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy dress that made me feel put together without trying too hard. I set the table with the good china I'd inherited from my mother, plates with tiny blue flowers around the rim that I'd only used a handful of times in my life. The house smelled like fresh bread and salmon and the roses on the table, and for a moment, standing there in my kitchen, I let myself feel genuinely happy. They arrived 15 minutes late, which was typical for Vivienne. I heard her voice before I saw her, that bright, carrying tone she used when she wanted everyone to know she'd arrived. I opened the door with a smile, and there they were, David in a button-down and khakis, Vivienne in designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire outfit. "Hi, Mom," David said, leaning in to hug me. He smelled like that expensive cologne, and for a moment, I held on a little tighter than necessary. "Patricia, hello," Vivienne said, offering me her cheek to kiss in that way that wasn't really affectionate, more like an obligation. "Your house smells wonderful." "Thank you," I said, stepping back to let them in. "Come in, please. Dinner's almost ready." They walked into my small living room, and I watched their eyes scan the space, the worn furniture, the carpet with its ancient stain, the bookshelves crammed with paperbacks and framed photos. I saw Vivienne's nose wrinkle almost imperceptibly, and something in me hardened. Not yet, I told myself. Wait. We sat down to eat, and for a while, it was almost nice. The food was good, I could tell by the way David ate, the way he complimented everything. Vivienne picked at her salmon but praised the lemon tart, which I chose to take as a victory. We talked about their work, their friends, a trip they were planning to Napa Valley. And then, as we were finishing dessert, David said, "So Mom, what's new with you? You've been pretty quiet lately." This was it. My moment. I'd planned this. I'd practiced. But suddenly, sitting there with them looking at me expectantly, I felt all my rehearsed words evaporate. So I just told them the truth. "Actually," I said, setting down my fork, "I've been working on a project. A big one. I bought a house in the historic district, the old Pritchard place, if you know it, and I've been renovating it for the past several months. It's almost finished, and I'm going to turn it into a short-term rental." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it was probably only a few seconds. David's mouth opened slightly, like he was trying to process what I'd said. Vivienne's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "You bought a house?" David said finally. "In the historic district?" "Yes." "When? Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to surprise you," I said, and it was partly true. I wanted to wait until it was finished so you could see what I'd accomplished. Vivienne let out a small laugh, the kind that wasn't really amused. "Patricia, do you have any idea how expensive those properties are? Or how much work they require?" "I do now," I said, meeting her eyes. "I've been doing most of the work myself, actually. Learning as I go." Another silence. Then David said, "Mom, that's great, but also kind of crazy. Do you even know what you're doing? Have you hired professionals? This sounds like it could be a money pit." And there it was, the doubt I'd been expecting, the assumption that I couldn't possibly handle something like this on my own. But instead of feeling small, I felt my spine straighten. "I've hired a contractor for the big stuff, yes," I said calmly. "But I've done a lot myself. And it's not a money pit. It's an investment. The rental market in that area is excellent, and I've done my research. This is going to generate income." Vivienne was looking at me like I'd just told her I was planning to join the circus. "But why?" she asked, and her tone held genuine confusion. "You're retired. You should be relaxing, enjoying yourself. Why would you take on something this stressful?" "Because you made me feel like I was nothing," I wanted to say. "Because you laughed at my life and my son said nothing. Because I needed to prove that I still mattered." But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I smiled. Because I wanted to. Because I'm not ready to just sit around waiting to get old. I still have things I want to do, things I want to build. David was shaking his head, not in disapproval exactly, but in that way people do when they're trying to make sense of something that doesn't fit their understanding of the world. I wish you'd told me, Mom. I could have helped. Given you advice, at least." "I didn't need advice," I said, and I heard the edge in my voice before I could soften it. "I needed to do this myself." Vivienne took a sip of her wine, and I saw something flicker across her face. Calculation, maybe, or curiosity. "Well," she said, setting down her glass, "I suppose we should come see it. This house you've been secretly renovating." "I'd like that," I said. "How about next weekend? I'm hosting a small gathering there. Just a few friends, some of the people who helped with the renovation. You could come for dinner. See what I've done." David looked at Vivienne, and she gave a small shrug. "We can probably make it work," he said. "Yeah, okay. Let's do it." After they left that night, I stood in my kitchen washing the dishes and replaying every moment of the conversation. They'd been surprised, yes. Skeptical, definitely. But they'd agreed to come. And that meant I'd have my chance to show them exactly what I was capable of. It meant I'd have my chance to watch their faces when they realized they'd underestimated me. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt exhausted. Because the truth was, even after everything I'd done, I was still looking for their approval. I was still performing for an audience that might never applaud. And that realization, that despite all my growth and independence, I still cared what they thought, stung more than I wanted to admit. But I'd come too far to turn back now. The dinner at the Pritchard house was going to happen. And whatever came of it, at least I'd know I'd tried. At least I'd know I'd fought. I spent the entire next week in a state of controlled chaos, preparing for the dinner party that would either vindicate everything I'd worked for or expose me as a foolish old woman playing pretend. I oscillated between confidence and terror so many times I gave myself a headache. The guest list was carefully curated. Hector and his wife Elena. Raymond from the hardware store and his partner Michael. Jolene, the realtor who'd sold me the property and had become something of a friend during the process. A couple I'd met at the community college course, retired teachers like me who'd bought and renovated a property on the other side of town and understood exactly what I'd gone through. And of course, David and Vivienne. I told everyone to come at 6:30. I told David and Vivienne to come at 7. I wanted the house already full of life and laughter when they arrived. I wanted them to walk into something that felt established, successful, real. The day of the party, I woke up at 5 in the morning with my heart racing. I drove to the Pritchard house, my house, I reminded myself, before the sun was fully up. The spring morning was cool and smelled like jasmine from the bush I'd planted along the side fence. I stood on the front porch for a moment, looking at the house I'd brought back to life, and I felt something fierce and protective surge through me. This was mine. Whatever happened tonight, no one could take that away. I'd hired a catering company for the food, not because I couldn't cook, but because I wanted tonight to be about the house, not about me running back and forth to the kitchen. The caterers arrived at 3, professional and efficient, setting up in the kitchen I'd rebuilt with my own hands. The menu was southern with upscale touches, she crab soup, shrimp and grits, fried green tomatoes with remoulade, and pecan pie with bourbon whipped cream. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The house glowed with warm light from the fixtures I'd chosen so carefully. Fresh flowers were everywhere. Magnolias in the parlor, hydrangeas in the dining room, roses on the side tables. Soft jazz played from a speaker I'd hidden behind a bookshelf. The house looked like something out of a magazine, and I had to keep reminding myself that I'd done this. Me. The woman Vivienne had pitied. My guests started arriving right on time. Hector came first with Elena, a petite woman with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile. She hugged me like we'd known each other for years. "Pat, this place is stunning," she said, her eyes sweeping across the foyer. Hector showed me pictures, but seeing it in person, it's incredible. Raymond and Michael brought wine, expensive bottles with French names I couldn't pronounce. The retired teachers, Janet and Tom, came bearing a beautiful coffee table book about historic Charleston homes. "You're going to be in the next edition," Janet said with a wink. "Mark my words." By 6:45, everyone was there except David and Vivienne. The house was full of conversation and laughter. People were admiring the crown molding, the restored fireplace, the way I'd balanced historic preservation with modern comfort. I felt like I was floating, buoyed by their praise and genuine appreciation. And then, at 7:05, the doorbell rang. I excused myself and walked to the front door, smoothing down the deep emerald dress I'd bought specifically for tonight. I took a breath and opened the door. David stood there with a bottle of wine, and Vivienne was beside him in a white pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She had oversized sunglasses pushed up on her head even though it was evening, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Mom," David said, and then he saw past me into the house, and his eyes went wide. "Wow. This is, wow." I stepped aside. "Come in." They walked in, and I watched their faces as they took in the transformation. The foyer with its refinished hardwood floors and the antique mirror I'd found at an estate sale. The parlor visible through the archway, with people gathered around, laughing, drinks in hand. The dining room beyond that, the table set with china and crystal that caught the light like tiny stars. "Patricia," Vivienne said slowly, "this is your house." "It is." She turned in a slow circle, and I couldn't quite read her expression. Surprise, definitely, but also something else. Something I'd been hoping for, a grudging respect. David was shaking his head. "Mom, this is incredible. I can't believe, you did this." "Most of it," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "I had help, obviously. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." I led them into the parlor where my friends, and yes, they'd become friends during this process, were gathered. I made introductions, and I saw the moment when David and Vivienne realized that these weren't just random people I'd hired for the evening. These were real relationships I'd built, people who knew me and respected me and were genuinely happy for my success. Hector shook David's hand firmly. "Your mother is one of the most determined people I've ever met," he said. She worked harder than some men half her age. You should be proud of her. I am, David said, but there was something in his voice, a note of confusion, maybe even hurt, that suggested he was grappling with the fact that I'd built this entire life without telling him. We moved into the dining room for dinner, and I'd arranged the seating carefully. David and Vivienne were at the table with everyone else, not separated or given special treatment. We were all equals here, all people who'd accomplished something worth celebrating. The meal was spectacular. The caterers had outdone themselves. But more than the food, it was the conversation that made the evening special. People told stories about the renovation, about the day we'd discovered original light fixtures hidden in the attic, about the time I'd fallen through a rotted floorboard and Hector had to pull me out while I laughed so hard I cried. They talked about my vision for the rental business, my plans to eventually buy another property and do it all again. I watched Vivienne throughout dinner. She was quieter than usual, picking at her food, her eyes moving around the table and the room. David kept looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and I wasn't sure if that was good or bad. After dinner, I gave them a tour of the house. All of them, not just David and Vivienne, because I wanted everyone to see the upstairs I'd finally finished. The bedrooms with their carefully chosen paint colors and restored original features. The bathroom where I'd found vintage tiles to replace the ones that were damaged. The small library I'd created in what had once been a servant's quarters, with built-in bookshelves and a window seat that looked out over the garden. We ended up back in the parlor as the evening wound down, people standing around with coffee and pie, the conversation flowing easily. I was talking to Janet about her own renovation experiences when I heard Vivienne's voice rise slightly from across the room. Well, she was saying to Elena and Jolene, I have to admit, when Patricia told us about this, I was skeptical. I mean, no offense, but taking on something like this at her age, with no experience, it seemed like a recipe for disaster. My spine stiffened, but I kept my face neutral, pretending I wasn't listening. But this is actually impressive, Vivienne continued. I mean, it's not quite what David and I are looking for. We're more interested in the deeper historic district, something with more prestige. But for a rental property, this could work. For a rental property. As if that diminished what I'd done somehow. As if the fact that I was going to rent it out instead of living here made it less valuable, less worthy. Elena, bless her, didn't miss a beat. Oh, this house has plenty of prestige, she said coolly. It's going to be one of the most sought-after rentals in the city. Pat's going to make a fortune. I'm sure she will, Vivienne said, and her smile was tight. It's just different from what I choose, that's all. Different. That word again. The same coded language she'd used that night at their dinner party, the same polite dismissal wrapped in a compliment. I felt Jolene move closer to me. She'd heard it too. You okay? She whispered. I nodded. I was okay. Because here's what I'd realized while standing there, listening to Vivienne try to find ways to minimize what I'd accomplished. I didn't need her to get it. I didn't need her approval or her praise or her validation. I had a room full of people who understood what this meant, who'd been part of the journey, who celebrated me without reservation. And that was enough. Or at least, I told myself it was enough. But there was a part of me, a small, stubborn part one couldn't quite silence, that still wanted her to see me. Really see me. To acknowledge that she'd been wrong about me, about my life, about my worth. I wanted an apology I knew I'd never get. The guests started leaving around 9:30, each of them hugging me, congratulating me again, promising to come back for the first official rental weekend. David and Vivienne were among the last to leave. David hugged me on the front porch, and this time, his embrace felt different. Tighter. More present. Mom, he said quietly, I'm really proud of you. And I'm sorry I didn't know about this. I should have been here for you. You're here now, I said, because what else could I say? Vivienne offered me another one of those cheek kisses, and up close, I could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive. Congratulations, Patricia, she said. You've done well for yourself. For yourself. Not you've done well or you should be proud. The qualifier stung, subtle as it was. They walked to their car, that sleek Mercedes that cost more than I'd spent on this entire renovation, and I watched them drive away into the Charleston night. I stood there on the porch for a long time after everyone had gone, listening to the sounds of the city settling down for the night. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. And in some ways, I did. But I also felt hollow. Because even after all of this, even after proving that I could do something remarkable, Vivienne had still found a way to make it feel small. And David, despite his pride and his apologies, had still let her. I locked up the house and drove home to my little vinyl-sided ranch, the one Vivienne had mocked, the one that suddenly felt even smaller than before. And I cried for the first time since this whole thing began. Not because I regretted what I'd done, but because I was exhausted. Exhausted from proving myself. Exhausted from seeking approval that would never come. Exhausted from caring so damn much about what they thought. But the night wasn't over yet. Because when I got home and checked my phone, there was a message waiting for me. A message from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. A message from Vivienne's best friend, Kelsey. And when I read it, everything changed. I almost didn't open the message. It was late, nearly 11, and I was emotionally wrung out from the evening. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and let sleep take me away from the confusing swirl of pride and disappointment that had been churning in my chest since David and Vivienne left. But something made me tap on the notification. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange timing. Why would Kelsey, who I'd only met a handful of times at David and Vivienne's events, be messaging me at this hour? Maybe it was just that I'd learned over the past months that unexpected things could lead to unexpected opportunities. The message was long. I sat down on my couch, still in my emerald dress, and read it 3 times before I could fully process what it was saying. Hi Patricia. I hope it's okay that I'm messaging you. I got your number from David's phone when they were over at our place last week. I've been going back and forth about whether to send this, but after tonight, I feel like I have to. You deserve to know what Vivienne has been saying about you. I've been friends with her since college, and I love her, but lately some of the things she says, they don't sit right with me anymore. Tonight after your party, she called me from the car. She was laughing, telling me about your little project house and how you're playing entrepreneur at your age. She said, and I quote, "I doubt if this house was not built for the birds. This below my standard." She was mocking you, Patricia. She said David's friends thought it was adorable that you were trying so hard to impress them, like a child showing off a crayon drawing. She said you'd probably lose all your money on this vanity project within a year. I told her she was being cruel, and she just laughed and said I was being too sensitive. I'm sorry to tell you this, but I thought you should know who you're really dealing with. You seem like a kind person who doesn't deserve to be treated this way. Kelsey. I sat there in the dim light of my living room, reading those words over and over until they blurred. Below my standard. Playing entrepreneur. A crayon drawing. I'd known Vivienne looked down on me. I'd known she found my life lacking. But seeing it spelled out like this, seeing her actual words translated through Kelsey's message, hit differently. It wasn't just dismissive, it was contemptuous. It was cruel in a way I hadn't fully let myself acknowledge before. And David. David had been in the car when she made that call. He'd heard her, or at least he'd been there while she said these things. And he'd said nothing. Done nothing. He'd let her mock his mother, the woman who'd raised him alone, who'd sacrificed everything for him, and he'd stayed silent. The hollow feeling I'd had earlier transformed into something else. Something harder. Something sharper. I typed back to Kelsey, "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate your honesty." She responded almost immediately, "I'm sorry if I upset you. I just couldn't keep quiet anymore. What you've done with that house is incredible, and you should be proud. Don't let her take that away from you." I set the phone down and sat in the darkness of my living room, listening to the familiar sounds of my little house. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. This house that Vivienne mocked. This house where I'd raised a good man who'd somehow forgotten where he came from. I thought about all the times over the past months when I'd imagined this moment. The reveal, the party, David and Vivienne seeing what I'd accomplished. In my fantasies, they'd been impressed. They'd apologized, maybe not explicitly, but through their actions, their attitudes, their newfound respect for me. I'd imagined Vivienne speechless with admiration, David proud and vocal about what his mother had done. Instead, I'd gotten polite congratulations and backhanded compliments to my face, followed by mockery the moment they were out the door. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, someone you trusted, you know that moment when the hurt transforms into something else. When you stop crying and start calculating. When you stop wanting their approval and start wanting them to understand exactly what they've lost. That's where I was at midnight on that Saturday in April, sitting alone in my living room with Kelsey's message glowing on my phone screen. I wasn't sad anymore. I was done being sad. Now I was angry. And anger, I was learning, could be a remarkable fuel when properly directed. I spent that night planning. Not revenge exactly, or not just revenge, but something bigger. A way to take everything I'd built and turn it into something that would make it impossible for them to dismiss me. Something that would force them to see me not as David's mother or as some quaint old lady playing pretend, but as someone successful in my own right. The rental business was just the start. I could see that now. The Pritchard house, I still thought of it that way sometimes, though it was mine now, thoroughly and completely mine, was proof of concept. It showed I could identify undervalued properties, renovate them, and turn them into something profitable. But one house was a fluke. One house was something they could wave away as beginner's luck or a waste of money disguised as success. 2 houses would be harder to dismiss. 3 would be a pattern. 4 would be a business. And a business empire built by a woman they'd mocked. That would be undeniable. I stayed up until 3 in the morning researching. I looked at other properties in Charleston, neighborhoods that were just starting to gentrify, houses that needed work but had potential. I ran numbers, renovation costs, rental rates, occupancy projections. I looked into business loans, LLC formation, tax implications. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness, and I took notes in a spiral notebook until my hand cramped. By the time the sun started rising, casting pale light through my bedroom window, I had the skeleton of a plan. It was ambitious. It was risky. It would require me to leverage everything I had, the equity in my own house, the potential income from the Pritchard property, every dollar of savings I had left. It would mean working harder than I'd ever worked, taking risks that would have terrified me 6 months ago. But 6 months ago, I'd been a different person. 6 months ago, I'd still believed that being small and quiet and grateful would earn me love and respect. Now I knew better. Now I knew that the only person who was going to fight for my value was me. I called Jolene at 9 in the morning, as soon as I thought it was reasonable. She answered on the second ring, her voice still gravelly with sleep. "Pat? Everything okay?" "I need to look at properties," I said. "Today, if possible. I'm ready to expand." There was a pause, and then I heard the sound of rustling, like she was sitting up in bed. "Expand? You mean buy another house?" "At least one. Maybe more. I want to build something real, Jolene. Something that can't be ignored." "Okay," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Okay, let me pull some listings. Can you meet me at 11? "I'll be there." We spent that entire Sunday looking at properties. Jolene showed me 6 different houses in various stages of disrepair, all of them in neighborhoods that were up and coming, which was real to speak for, not great now but might be valuable later. Some were too far gone, structural nightmares that would cost more to fix than they'd ever be worth. Some were overpriced, sellers hoping to catch some sucker who didn't know better. But one of them, a narrow shotgun-style house in the Elliottboro neighborhood, made my heart race with possibility. It was a disaster, no question. The previous owner had been a hoarder, and the place was filled with decades of accumulated junk. The floors were water-damaged, the kitchen was from the 1950s, and there was visible mold in 2 of the bedrooms. But it had high ceilings, original pine floors under the damage, and a long, narrow backyard that could be transformed into a garden. And the price was right, low enough that I could afford it if I got creative with financing. "I want to make an offer," I told Jolene as we stood in the wreckage of what had once been a living room. "Pat, this one's going to be a lot of work. Maybe even more than the Pritchard house." "I know. But I can do it. And when I'm done, this is going to be one of the most charming properties in the neighborhood." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded. "Let's write up an offer." Over the next few days, things moved quickly. My offer was accepted. I met with my bank about a home equity line of credit on my own house, something that made me nervous but also felt like the right move. I called Hector and asked if he and his crew would be willing to take on another project. He laughed and said, "Pat, you're becoming one of my best clients. Of course we'll do it." I didn't tell David. Not yet. Not about the new house, not about the business I was building, not about any of it. Because this wasn't for him anymore. This wasn't about proving myself to him or Vivienne or anyone else. This was about proving something to myself, that I could build something significant, something that would outlast me, something that would make a mark on this city I loved. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that imagined the day when David would realize what I'd built. When he'd see that I wasn't just his mother, wasn't just someone to be managed and humored and occasionally pitied. I was a business owner. An entrepreneur. Someone who'd taken risks and succeeded. Someone who'd built an empire from nothing while they'd been laughing at me behind my back. That thought kept me warm on the nights when I lay awake worrying about money, about whether I'd bitten off more than I could chew, about what would happen if this all fell apart. But it wasn't going to fall apart. I wouldn't let it. The message from Kelsey had been a gift, even though it hurt. It had shown me the truth of what I was dealing with. And the truth, painful as it was, had set me free from the last remaining threads of hope that they would change, that they would see me differently, that I could earn their respect through any means other than undeniable success. So that's what I'd give them. Success so loud, so visible, so impossible to ignore that they'd have no choice but to acknowledge it. And when that day came, I'd be ready. I'd smile, I'd be gracious, and I'd let them know, without saying a single word, that their approval had come too late to matter anymore. The next 6 months were the hardest and most exhilarating of my life. I threw myself into the renovation of the Elliott house. I'd started calling it that in my head, with an intensity that surprised even me. I was at one property or the other almost every day, sometimes splitting my time between them, coordinating with Hector's crew, making decisions about paint colors and fixtures and floor plans at a pace that would have overwhelmed me a year ago. But I wasn't the same woman I'd been a year ago. That woman had been afraid. That woman had needed permission. This version of me, the one with plaster dust in her hair and calluses on her hands and a business plan tucked in her purse, she didn't ask for permission anymore. She just did. The Pritchard house had its first guests in late May, a couple from Boston celebrating their anniversary. They loved it. They left a glowing 5-star review on the rental platform, raving about the historic charm combined with modern comfort, about the thoughtful touches like the fresh flowers and the locally-made soap in the bathroom and the guidebook I'd created highlighting the best restaurants and shops in Charleston. That review led to more bookings, and suddenly the property was rented almost every weekend through the summer. The income was real. Not enough to make me rich, but enough to prove the model worked. Enough to make the loan payments and start building a reserve fund. Enough to show that this wasn't a vanity project or a fluke, this was an actual business. I reinvested every dollar I could into the Elliott house. That property was proving more challenging than the first. The structural issues were worse than we'd initially thought. We had to replace most of the floor joists in the back half of the house. The electrical system had to be completely redone. There was a plumbing nightmare involving corroded cast iron pipes that had to be replaced with PVC. Every time Hector found another problem, another expensive fix that would push back the timeline and blow through the budget, I felt my stomach drop. But then I'd remember Vivienne's words, playing entrepreneur, below my standard, and I'd grit my teeth and figure out how to make it work. I learned to be creative. I haunted estate sales and architectural salvage stores, finding fixtures and materials for a fraction of what they'd cost new. I learned which corners I could cut without sacrificing quality and which things I absolutely had to invest in. I learned to negotiate with contractors, with suppliers, with everyone. I learned that being a 63-year-old woman sometimes worked in my favor. People underestimated me, and I could use that. Raymond became an invaluable resource. He knew everyone in Charleston, it seemed, and he connected me with people who could help, a tile setter who did side work on weekends, a carpenter who built me custom shelves at half the price I'd been quoted elsewhere, a landscaper who was just starting out and willing to offer competitive rates in exchange for being able to use the before and after photos in his portfolio. I built a team, a network of people who believed in what I was doing. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like an imposter. I stopped waiting for someone to tell me I didn't belong in this world. I started introducing myself as a real estate investor and property manager, and I said it with confidence because it was true. I still hadn't told David about the second property. We talked occasionally, brief phone calls where he'd tell me about work and I'd make vague comments about staying busy. He asked about the Pritchard house once, and I told him it was doing well, that I'd had steady bookings. He seemed pleased but distant, like he was checking a box rather than actually engaging with what I was doing. Vivienne never called. Not once. I told myself I didn't care. Most days, I actually believed it. In August, I saw on social media that they'd finally bought their dream house in the historic district. It was magnificent, a 3-story Georgian mansion with a double piazza porch, original hardwood throughout, a chef's kitchen that looked like something out of a magazine. The photos Vivienne posted showed her standing in the grand foyer, her arms spread wide, the caption reading, "Finally found our forever home. Can't wait to start this new chapter. #Charleston living #historic homes #blessed." I stared at those photos longer than I should have. The house was beautiful. There was no denying that. And I should have been happy for them, or at least indifferent. But instead, I felt that old familiar ache, the sense that no matter what I did, they would always be ahead of me, always have more, always be more impressive. Then I closed the app, put down my phone, and went back to work on the Elliott house. Because the difference between us wasn't just money or privilege. It was that everything they had was given or expected. Everything I had, I'd built with my own hands. By September, both properties were fully operational. The Elliott house had its first guests in early October, and like the Pritchard house, it was an instant hit. I'd designed it differently, more colorful, more eclectic, targeting a younger crowd who wanted Instagram-worthy backdrops. I'd painted one bedroom a bold mustard yellow, another a deep navy. I'd hung local art on the walls. I'd created a backyard patio with string lights and a fire pit where guests could gather in the evenings. The reviews were spectacular. People loved the unique character, the attention to detail, the way the house felt like a home rather than just a rental. Bookings poured in. I raised the rates and they still poured in. By November, I'd paid back the initial home equity loan on my own house. By December, I was looking at a third property. This time, I didn't just want another house. I wanted something that would make a statement. I wanted something that would put me on the map not just as a small-time landlord but as a serious player in Charleston's hospitality scene. I found it in January of the new year, a former corner store in the Upper Peninsula that had been sitting vacant for years. The building was brick, 2 stories, with huge windows and amazing light. It had originally been built in the 1920s, and while it had been neglected, the bones were solid. The first floor was one huge open space that had once been the retail area. The second floor had been residential space for whoever owned the store, divided into small rooms that could be reconfigured. It was perfect for what I had in mind, a luxury short-term rental, bigger than my other properties, able to accommodate groups or families. I could see it so clearly. The first floor turned into an open-concept living area with a massive kitchen, the second floor with 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Modern design that respected the historic character. Exposed brick and original pine floors combined with contemporary fixtures and high-end finishes. It was expensive. More expensive than both my other properties combined. It would require me to take on partners or investors, something I'd avoided so far because I liked maintaining control. It would mean incorporating as an actual LLC, bringing on a property manager to help me juggle multiple locations, scaling up in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I sat with the decision for a week, running numbers, wargaming scenarios, trying to imagine all the ways it could go wrong. And then I thought about where I'd been 2 years ago, sitting at a dinner table, being mocked, feeling invisible. I thought about Kelsey's message, about Vivienne's words, below my standard. And I made an offer on the building. It took 3 months to put together the financing. I brought in 2 silent partners, a retired couple I'd met through Janet and Tom who had money to invest and liked my track record. I officially formed Green Palmetto Properties LLC, with myself as the managing member. I hired a bookkeeper to help me manage the finances across multiple properties. I bought business cards that said Patricia Morrison, founder and CEO. CEO of my own company, at 65 years old. The renovation of the corner store building was the most ambitious project yet. We knocked down walls, reinforced the structure, installed all new systems. I worked with an interior designer for the first time, a young woman named Ashley who understood my vision and helped me execute it at a level I couldn't have achieved on my own. We sourced furniture and art and textiles that made the space feel both luxurious and inviting. It took 8 months to complete. 8 months of budget overruns and permit delays and moments where I lay awake at night wondering if I'd finally gone too far, finally taken on more than I could handle. But Hector and his crew stayed with me. My partners trusted me. And I refused to quit. The property, I called it the Corner House, opened for bookings in October. The rates were significantly higher than my other properties. I targeted corporate retreats, family reunions, groups of friends celebrating milestones. I hired a professional photographer who shot images that looked like they belonged in Architectural Digest. And then, because I'd learned that you had to be willing to promote yourself in this business, I reached out to a local lifestyle blogger who'd been featuring Charleston properties. She came for a tour, fell in love with the corner house, and wrote a feature about it that went viral in Charleston's social media circles. Suddenly, everyone was talking about this property. About the woman who'd transformed a derelict corner store into one of the most sought-after rentals in the city. About Green Palmetto Properties and its trajectory of success. The Charleston newspaper did a feature on me. Local entrepreneur revitalizes historic properties, the headline read. There was a photo of me standing in front of the corner house, smiling, looking every bit like someone who belonged in that world. I framed that article and hung it in my office. Yes, I had an office now, a small space I rented in a co-working building downtown. And every time I looked at it, I remembered that dinner party 3 years ago. I remembered Vivienne's laugh and David's silence and the way I'd driven home crying. Look at me now, I thought. Look at what I built. I knew David had seen the article. He'd have to be living under a rock not to. Charleston wasn't that big of a city, and the story had made the rounds. But he didn't call. Didn't text. Nothing. That silence hurt more than I wanted to admit. Because even after all of this, even after building something undeniable, he still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. To reach out. To say he was proud. Or maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe seeing his mother succeed in such a public way made him uncomfortable, reminded him of all the times he'd let Vivienne diminish me while he stood by and said nothing. Maybe my success was a mirror he didn't want to look into. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my business, my properties, my team. I had respect from people who actually mattered. Other business owners, my partners, the guests who stayed at my properties and left glowing reviews. I didn't need David's approval anymore. But late at night, when I was alone in my little house, the one I still lived in, the one I'd never sell because it was home, I'd think about my son and wonder how we'd gotten here. How the boy I'd raised, the one I'd sacrificed everything for, could watch me build an empire and respond with silence. It was February when everything came to a head. I was at the corner house doing a walkthrough before a new group checked in when my phone rang. David's name lit up the screen, and my heart jumped even though I tried to tell myself it shouldn't. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, keeping my voice casual. "Mom." His voice was strained. "Can we talk? Vivienne and we'd like to take you to dinner. Tomorrow night, if you're available." Tomorrow was Saturday. I had 3 properties to check on, a meeting with a potential investor for a 4th property, and a dozen other things on my to-do list. But this was David asking. David reaching out after months of silence. "I'm available," I said. "Where and when?" "That place you took us to before, do you remember? The one with the terrace. Let's say 7. The place I took them to? I'd never taken them anywhere with a terrace. And then I realized, he meant their place. He meant that night 3 years ago that had started this whole thing. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "Sure. I'll be there." I spent the next day in a state of anxious anticipation. What did they want? Was this finally the acknowledgement I'd been waiting for? Or was it something else, a criticism, a lecture about how I was being too ambitious, too visible, too much? I dressed carefully that evening in a navy blazer and cream-colored pants, elegant but understated. Professional. I'd learned over the past 3 years that how you presented yourself mattered, and I wanted to walk into that house looking like someone who'd earned her place at the table. Their house, the Georgian mansion they'd bought, was even more impressive in person than in the photos. The driveway was lined with gas lanterns that cast a warm glow. The front door was painted a glossy black with a brass knocker that probably cost more than my first month's mortgage payment had been 40 years ago. Vivienne answered the door in white linen pants and a silk blouse, her hair in a perfect chignon. "Patricia," she said with that practiced smile. "Thank you for coming." She led me through the house, and it was a tour, make no mistake, even though she pretended it wasn't. She pointed out the original moldings, the restored chandelier, the kitchen renovation they'd just completed. Everything was perfect, magazine-ready, the kind of home that felt more like a showroom than a place where people actually lived. David was waiting on the terrace. Yes, of course they had a terrace, with drinks already poured. He hugged me, and I tried to read his face, but he was guarded in a way he'd never been when he was young. We sat at an iron table with comfortable cushions, and for a while, we made small talk. They asked about my properties, and I gave them brief updates, downplaying the success because some instinct told me that's what they wanted. They told me about their work, about their social calendar, about a trip they were planning to Italy in the spring. And then Vivienne set down her wine glass and said, "Patricia, we asked you here because we have a proposition for you." I felt my stomach tighten. A proposition. David leaned forward. "We've been watching what you've built, Mom. The properties, the business, it's really impressive. More impressive than I think either of us expected, if I'm being honest." There it was. The acknowledgement I'd wanted. But the way he said it, more than we expected, it stung. Because it confirmed what I'd always suspected, they'd never believed I could do this. They'd been waiting for me to fail. "Thank you," I said carefully. Vivienne picked up where David left off. "The thing is, we've been thinking about getting into real estate investment ourselves. David's portfolio is doing well, and we have capital we'd like to put to work. And when we started researching the market, we kept coming back to what you've done. You've identified a really strong niche, the historic property rental market." I said nothing, just waited for the other shoe to drop. "So we have a proposal," David said. "We'd like to buy into Green Palmetto Properties. Become partners. We'd bring capital, business expertise, connections. Vivienne's family knows everyone in this city. We could scale this thing up, maybe double or triple the portfolio within a year. Turn it into something really significant." I stared at them, trying to process what they were offering. They wanted to buy into my business. The business I'd built from nothing. The business that was mine. "We'd obviously offer a fair valuation," Vivienne added. "We'd bring in an accountant to assess the current value and—" "What percentage are you thinking?" I interrupted. They exchanged a glance. "We were thinking 4 to 9%, David said. "That would leave you with controlling interest, so you'd still be in charge, but we'd be equal partners in the decision-making." 4 to 9%. Of everything I'd built. Everything I'd fought for. And in exchange, I'd have to share every decision with them, have to justify my choices, have to listen to Vivienne's opinions about properties that were below her standard. If you're watching this and you've ever built something from nothing, you know that moment when someone tries to take it from you. Maybe they don't see it that way. Maybe in their minds, they're offering help, offering partnership. But what they're really doing is trying to rewrite the story so that your success becomes partly theirs. So that they can point to it and say, "We did that together," when the truth is you did it alone while they watched and doubted and dismissed. I took a sip of my wine and looked out over their perfectly manicured garden, lit with strategic landscape lighting that probably cost thousands. And I thought about that message from Kelsey. I thought about Vivienne laughing on the phone, calling my house something built for birds. I thought about 3 years of hard work, of learning and failing and getting back up and trying again. Of building something that was mine, completely and totally mine. "No," I said quietly. "No." Vivienne's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Patricia, I don't think you understand what we're offering. The capital alone would." "I understand exactly what you're offering," I said, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "And the answer is no. Green Palmetto Properties isn't for sale. Not any percentage of it." David leaned back in his chair. "Mom, be reasonable. You can't possibly think you can keep growing at this rate without bringing in additional capital and expertise. He caught himself, but I heard the rest of the sentence even though he didn't say it. "You're old. You're out of your depth. You're going to fail without us." "I already have partners for the properties that need them," I said. "And I have a business plan for sustainable growth that doesn't require leveraging everything I've built. I'm doing just fine on my own." "This is about money?" Vivienne asked, and there was an edge to her voice now. "If the offer isn't high enough, we can negotiate." "It's not about money. It's about the fact that you're only interested now that it's successful. Where were you 3 years ago when I bought the Pritchard house? Where were you when I was scrubbing floors and learning how to install tile and working 16-hour days to make it work? You were laughing at me, telling your friends I was playing entrepreneur, that my houses were below your standard." Vivienne's face went pale. David's head snapped toward her. "What is she talking about?" "I don't know," Vivienne said quickly. "Patricia, I never." "Your friend Kelsey sent me a message," I said, and I watched Vivienne's expression shift from confusion to horror. "After that first dinner party at the Pritchard house. She told me what you said. How you mocked me, my home, my work. So no, Vivienne, You don't get to buy into my success now. You don't get to attach your name to something you tried to tear down." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the fountain in their garden, the distant sound of traffic, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. David was looking at Vivienne with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe. Or maybe he was just surprised I'd found out. Maybe he'd known all along what she said, what she thought, and he'd just hoped I'd never know. That thought, that possibility, made my chest ache. "I should go," I said, standing up. "Mom, wait." David stood too, reaching for my arm. I pulled away. "I built something, David. Something I'm proud of. I did it without you, without her, without anyone who didn't believe in me. And I'm going to keep building it, on my own terms. Maybe someday we can have a relationship that isn't based on you being ashamed of where you came from and me trying to prove I'm worth your respect. But that day isn't today." I walked through their beautiful house, past all their expensive things, and I didn't look back. I got in my Honda Civic with its dent in the passenger door, and I drove back to my little vinyl-sided ranch house, and I sat in my driveway for a long time before I could bring myself to go inside. I wasn't crying. I'd cried enough over them. Instead, I felt something like relief. Like a weight I'd been carrying for 3 years had finally been lifted. Because I'd said no. I'd protected what was mine. I'd refused to let them take credit for work they'd had no part in. And that felt like the truest victory I'd had yet. The fallout from that dinner was immediate and brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. David called the next morning, his voice tight with anger, not at Vivienne, but at me. He told me I'd embarrassed them, that I'd been unfair to Vivienne, that I'd taken something Kelsey said out of context. He said I was being stubborn and short-sighted, turning down an opportunity that could transform my business because of hurt feelings and grudges. I listened without interrupting, and when he was done, I said, "I love you, David. But I'm not going to apologize for protecting something I built. If you can't understand that, then I don't know what else to say." He hung up without saying goodbye. That was in February. By March, we'd barely spoken. A few terse text messages about logistics. Did I want them to mail me the birthday card they'd gotten for me, or should they just donate the money to charity in my name? That sort of thing. Cold, transactional, emptied of anything that resembled a parent-child relationship. I told myself it was for the best. That I needed to focus on my business, on my properties, on building something that would last. And during the day, when I was busy with work, that felt true. But at night, in my quiet house, I'd think about the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd bring me dandelions from the yard like they were roses, who'd tell me I was the best mom in the world. Where had that boy gone? When had he become this man who could cut me out of his life so easily? The business, at least, was thriving. The corner house was booked solid through the spring and summer. The Pritchard house and the Elliott house had steady streams of guests, enough that I'd hired a cleaning crew and a handyman to help with maintenance and turnovers. I was making real money now, not Vivienne and David money, but enough that I could pay myself a salary, reinvest in the properties, and still have something left over to save. I bought a new car in April. Nothing extravagant, a sensible crossover that didn't have a dent in the door and had Bluetooth and a backup camera. But it was new, and it was mine, and the first time I drove it, I felt a surge of pride that surprised me with its intensity. In May, a business magazine in Charleston did a feature on women entrepreneurs over 60. They interviewed me, took photos at the corner house, asked about my journey from retired teacher to property mogul. The article was titled "Never Too Late: How Patricia Morrison Built a Real Estate Empire in Her 60s." My phone exploded with messages after that article came out. Former colleagues from my teaching days, friends I hadn't heard from in years, even a few distant relatives, everyone wanted to congratulate me, to tell me how inspiring I was, to ask for advice on their own ventures. It was overwhelming and validating and exhausting all at once. David didn't call. Didn't text. Nothing. I saw on social media that he and Vivienne had gone to Italy for their spring trip. The photos showed them in Rome, in Florence, in some vineyard in Tuscany with golden afternoon light and glasses of wine. They looked happy. They looked like people whose lives were uncomplicated by family drama or hurt feelings or mothers who'd refused to know their place. I stopped looking at their social media after that. It was a form of self-harm, I realized, this constant checking to see what they were doing, whether they were happy without me. It didn't matter whether they were happy. What mattered was whether I was happy. And was I? That was the question I couldn't quite answer. Professionally, absolutely. I loved what I'd built. I loved walking into my properties and seeing families on vacation, couples celebrating anniversaries, friends reuniting for long weekends. I loved the reviews that praised not just the houses but the experience, the care I'd put into every detail. I loved that I'd created something that brought joy to people while also securing my own financial future. But personally, that was harder. Because success had cost me my relationship with my son. And some days, standing alone in one of my beautiful properties, I'd wonder if it had been worth it. If maybe I should have just swallowed my pride, accepted their investment, let them have a piece of what I'd built in exchange for keeping the peace. Then I'd remember Vivienne's words, below my standard, playing entrepreneur, and I'd know I'd made the right choice. Because some things are worth more than peace. Dignity, for instance. Self-respect. The knowledge that you didn't compromise yourself for the comfort of people who'd never respected you in the first place. Raymond stopped by my office one afternoon in June. I'd been going over booking calendars, trying to figure out if I could squeeze in some maintenance work at the Pritchard house between guests, when he knocked on the door frame. "Got a minute?" he asked. "For you? Always." He sat down across from me, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it, okay?" I nodded, suddenly nervous. "You did good, Pat. What you built, what you accomplished, it's remarkable. And I know it's been hard with your son. I know that's been eating at you, even if you don't talk about it much. But I want you to understand something. You can't make people appreciate you. You can't force them to see your worth. All you can do is know your own worth and live accordingly. And that's what you've done." I felt my throat tighten. Some days I wonder if I did the right thing. If maybe I should have been more flexible, more forgiving. Flexible? You spent your whole life being flexible for other people. You raised a son alone while working 3 jobs. You kept a house you could barely afford because it was what he needed. You made yourself small so he could feel big. And when you finally, decided to build something for yourself, to take up space, to matter, that's when you were supposed to be flexible. He shook his head. "No, Pat. You did the right thing. And if your son can't see that, if he can't appreciate having a mother who refused to give up, who proved that age is just a number and determination is everything, well, that's his loss. Not yours." I wiped at my eyes, trying not to let the tears fall. "Thank you for saying that. I'm saying it because it's true. Now stop second-guessing yourself and get back to being the badass businesswoman you've become." After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the framed newspaper article on my wall. "Never Too Late," the headline read. And maybe that wasn't just about starting a business in your 60s. Maybe it was also about learning to value yourself, to put your own worth first, to refuse to accept being treated as less than. Maybe it was never too late for any of that. In July, I closed on a 4th property, a small cottage in the Halston Village neighborhood that needed minimal work. With this one, I was able to pay cash, no partners required. Green Palmetto Properties now had 4 houses generating consistent income, a solid reputation in Charleston's vacation rental market, and a waiting list of people wanting to book. I was 66 years old, and I was running a successful business. I was employing people, cleaners, handymen, a part-time property manager. I was contributing to Charleston's economy, paying taxes, providing a service people valued. I was someone. Not because of my relationship to anyone else, not because of my son or his wife or their opinions, but because of what I'd built with my own hands and determination. And you know what? That was enough. It had to be enough. Because it was all I had, and I'd worked too hard to diminish it by wishing for approval that might never come. If you're building something right now, a business, a life, a second act, and people who should support you don't, I want you to know something: keep building anyway. Build it for yourself. Build it because you deserve to take up space, to matter, to be more than someone's mother or daughter or wife or whatever role you've been assigned. Build it because you can, because you're capable, because the world needs what you have to offer. And if the people who should celebrate you can't bring themselves to do it, build it anyway. Build it especially. Check the description box below for more stories like this. Stories about people who chose themselves when everyone else wanted them to choose differently. Stories about women who refused to shrink. Stories about late bloomers and second acts and victories that came at a cost but were worth it anyway. By August, I'd stopped checking my phone hoping for a message from David. I'd stopped wondering if he'd seen my latest success or heard about my newest property. I'd stopped living my life in relation to his opinion of it. I'd started living it for myself. And that, I was learning, was the truest freedom I'd ever known. It was a Wednesday in late September when everything changed again. I was at the Pritchard house, meeting with Ashley about potential updates to the decor, when my phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. "This is Patricia," I answered. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Dr. Patel from MUSC. I'm calling about your son, David. He's listed you as his emergency contact." The world tilted. My legs went weak, and I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. What happened? Is he? He was in a car accident this morning. He's stable, but he has some injuries we're monitoring. Can you come to the hospital? I don't remember the drive. I don't remember parking or walking through the emergency room doors. All I remember is the fear, primal, consuming fear that I hadn't felt since David was a child and spiked a fever so high I thought I'd lose him. A nurse directed me to the ICU waiting room. And there, sitting in a plastic chair with her perfect hair disheveled and mascara smeared under her eyes, was Vivienne. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then her face crumpled, and she started crying, really crying, not the delicate tears I'd seen her use for effect at various social events, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook her whole body. I sat down next to her. "What happened?" "Someone ran a red light," she said, her voice breaking. "Hit the driver's side. He has a broken arm, 3 broken ribs, and they're worried about internal bleeding. They're watching him, but they said the next 24 hours are critical." Critical. That word hung in the air between us, terrible and absolute. "Where is he?" "They won't let me back yet. Only immediate family during the first hour after admission, and we're not." She stopped, seemed to realize what she was saying. "We weren't married when he'd filled out his emergency contact forms. I was still listed as next of kin. A doctor came out then, a young woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Dr. Patel. She explained David's injuries in more detail, using medical terms I tried to follow but couldn't quite grasp. The important part was, he was alive. He was stable. But the next day would be crucial. "Can I see him?" I asked. "For a few minutes. He's sedated, but you can sit with him." I followed her through the doors, down a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and floor cleaner, into a room where my son lay in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed. His left arm was in a cast. His face was bruised and swollen. There were tubes and wires connecting him to various monitors. He looked young in that bed. Like the boy I'd raised, the one who'd needed me, the one who'd loved me without complication or condition. I sat in the chair beside his bed and took his uninjured hand in mine. It was warm, solid, real. "I'm here, baby," I whispered. "I'm right here." I don't know how long I sat there. Time felt suspended, meaningless. Eventually, a nurse came in and said visiting hours were over, that I should go home and rest, that they'd call if anything changed. I went back to the waiting room. Vivienne was still there, staring at her phone without really seeing it. "You should go home," I told her. "Get some rest." "I'll stay." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I can't leave him. He's in good hands. And you won't do him any good if you fall apart." "I don't want to be alone," she said, and her voice was so small, so vulnerable, that for the first time since I'd known her, I saw past the polished exterior to the frightened person underneath. "Then don't be. Come home with me." She blinked, surprised. "To your house?" "Yes. I have a guest room. You can shower, eat something, try to sleep. We'll come back first thing in the morning." She hesitated, and I could see her weighing her options, her pride against her fear. Finally, she nodded. We drove to my house in silence. I was acutely aware of what she must be seeing: the modest neighborhood, the vinyl siding, the small yard with its vegetable garden that was starting to wind down for the season. The house that she'd called below her standard, that she'd mocked to her friends. But she didn't say anything. She just followed me inside, and when I showed her to the guest room, David's old room, though I'd redecorated it years ago, she said, "Thank you, Patricia." I made us grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food from my teaching days when I'd learned that sometimes the simplest things were what people needed most. We ate at my small kitchen table, and for a while, We didn't talk. Then Vivienne said, "I'm sorry." I looked up from my soup. For what? For everything. For the things I said about you, about your house, about your business. For treating you like you didn't matter. For making David think he had to choose between his old life and his new one, between you and me. She was crying again, quieter now. I was wrong. I was so wrong. And if something happens to him, the last real conversation I'll have had with his mother was me trying to buy into her business like it was some transaction instead of her life's work. I reached across the table and took her hand. David's going to be okay. You don't know that. No. But I'm choosing to believe it. And in the meantime, we're both going to be here for him. Together. She squeezed my hand. I don't know how you can be kind to me after everything I've done. Because you're scared and you love my son, and right now, that's all that matters. We finished eating in silence, and then I showed her where the towels were, gave her one of my t-shirts to sleep in since she hadn't brought anything with her. She showered, and I heard her crying in there, the sound muffled by the running water. I cleaned up the kitchen and then sat in my living room, in the same chair where I'd sat the night I got Kelsey's message, the night that had set so many things in motion. And I thought about how strange life was, how you could build walls and burn bridges and think you were done with people, and then one phone call could bring it all crashing down. I thought about all the anger I'd carried, all the hurt I'd accumulated and used as fuel to build my business. It had served a purpose. It had driven me to accomplish things I'd never imagined I could do. But sitting there in my living room, thinking about David in that hospital bed, I realized something. Anger is a powerful fuel, but it's not sustainable. Eventually, it burns through everything, including the person carrying it. I'd proven what I needed to prove. I'd built what I needed to build. And maybe now, if David survived, when David survived, I corrected myself. Maybe we could find a way forward that wasn't built on hurt and resentment and the desperate need for validation. Maybe we could just be a family again. The next morning, Vivienne and I drove to the hospital together. David had made it through the night. The internal bleeding had stopped on its own. He was going to need surgery on his arm, but the doctors were optimistic. He was going to be okay. When he woke up and saw me standing there beside Vivienne, his eyes filled with tears. "Mom," he said, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed. "You came." "Of course I came, baby. I'll always come." "I'm sorry," he said. "For everything. For not standing up for you, for letting Viv say those things, for being so stupid and proud that I let months go by without talking to you. I'm so sorry, Mom." I leaned down and kissed his forehead. "We're going to be okay. All of us. We're going to figure this out." And standing there in that hospital room with my injured son and his remorseful wife, surrounded by machines that proved how fragile life really was, I meant it. We were going to be okay. Because that's what families do. They hurt each other, they drift apart, they let pride and anger build walls between them. But when it matters, when life strips away all the petty grievances and leaves only what's essential, they come back together. They remember that love, however imperfect, is what endures. David's recovery took 3 months. 3 months of hospital visits and physical therapy appointments and slow, careful conversations where we started to rebuild what had been broken between us. Vivienne was there for all of it, not the polished, perfect version of herself she usually presented, but someone more real, more vulnerable. Someone I started to actually like. We talked a lot during those months, Vivienne and I. Usually in waiting rooms or hospital cafeterias, those strange liminal spaces where people become more honest than they might otherwise be. She told me about growing up with money, how it had given her everything except the ability to handle failure or criticism. How she'd built her entire identity around status and appearances because she'd never learned that she could be valuable for any other reason. "I looked at your life," she told me one afternoon while David was in physical therapy, "and I saw everything I'd been taught to avoid. Modest house, working-class background, no family connections. And instead of seeing your strength, all the ways you'd survived and succeeded despite having nothing handed to you, I just saw less. Less than what I had. Less than what I thought David deserved. And now?" I asked. "Now I see how wrong I was. You built something real, Patricia. You built it from nothing, with no safety net, no family money, no connections. Just determination and vision and guts. What I've done, the life David and I have, it's all been so easy. Money makes everything easy. And I mistook ease for accomplishment. I could have been petty. I could have thrown her words back at her, made her feel small the way she'd made me feel. But sitting there watching my son work so hard just to lift his arm above his shoulder, I didn't have the energy for revenge anymore. I was tired of anger. I was tired of hurt. I wanted something different. We all have our own journey, I said. Yours is just beginning. The question is what you're going to do with it now that you see things differently. She thought about that for a while. Then she said, I'd like to learn from you. If you'd be willing to teach me. About the business, about what it takes to actually build something. Not invest in something that's already successful, but start from the ground up. I looked at her carefully, trying to determine if this was genuine or just another way to get access to my business. But what I saw in her face was real humility, real interest. Let me think about it, I said. Over the next few weeks, as David got stronger, Vivienne started showing up at my properties. Not to criticize or take over, but to learn. She helped me style rooms for photo shoots. She watched me handle difficult guest situations. She asked questions about budgets and financing and marketing strategies. She was genuinely curious, genuinely engaged in a way she'd never been about anything except her social calendar and her Instagram feed. And slowly, carefully, I started to trust that maybe she was serious. Maybe this crisis had changed her, had stripped away some of the armor she wore and revealed someone capable of growth. By Christmas, David was almost back to normal. His arm was healed, his ribs didn't hurt anymore, and he'd returned to work on a limited basis. We had Christmas dinner at my house, my choice, my insistence. I cooked a turkey and all the fixings, and we ate in my small dining room with its view of the backyard where David used to play as a child. Vivienne brought wine and homemade cranberry sauce, and she complimented my house in a way that felt genuine. It's warm, she said. It feels like a home. Like a place where people actually live and love and make memories. Our house is beautiful, but it doesn't feel like this. You could make it feel like this, I said. If you wanted to. If you filled it with things that mattered instead of just things that impressed people. She nodded slowly. I'm starting to understand the difference. After dinner, David pulled me aside while Vivienne was in the kitchen doing dishes by hand in my ancient dishwasher that only worked half the time, and she didn't complain once. Thank you, Mom, he said. For what? For not giving up on us. For being here even after I was such an ass. For giving Vivienne a chance to be better than she was. You're my son, I said simply. I'm always going to show up for you. Even when you make it hard. Even when we fight. That's what family means. His eyes got wet, and he hugged me, and for a moment, we were just a mother and son who loved each other despite all the ways they'd hurt each other. In January, Vivienne came to me with a proposal. I want to start my own business, she said. Not competing with you, something different. Interior design for vacation rentals. Helping other property owners style their spaces to be more appealing, more bookable. And I want your blessing to do it, and maybe your advice occasionally, but I want to do it on my own. Build something that's mine. I looked at this woman who'd once mocked everything about my life, who'd called my houses below her standard, who'd made me feel small and invisible. And I saw someone different now. Someone humbled by crisis, changed by perspective, genuinely trying to become better. You have my blessing, I said. And more than that, you have my support. When you're ready, I'll be your first client. The properties can always use a refresh, and I'd rather pay someone who's learning and trying than someone who thinks they already know everything. She hugged me then, hard and genuine, and whispered, "Thank you for not hating me." I never hated you, I said, and it was true. I was hurt by you. But hate? That takes too much energy, and I have better things to do with my energy now. Spring came to Charleston with its usual spectacular display, azaleas blooming in riots of pink and purple, wisteria draping over fences like lavender waterfalls, the air sweet with jasmine and honeysuckle. I'd been in business for 5 years now. Green Palmetto Properties had 6 properties, all of them successful, all of them booked solid most of the year. I'd been featured in national publications about women entrepreneurs. I'd been invited to speak at a conference about starting over after 60. I was 70 years old, and I was living a life I'd never imagined possible when I'd sat at that dinner table 5 years ago and heard Vivienne dismiss my entire existence with a laugh. One evening in April, David and Vivienne invited me to their house for dinner. Just the 3 of us, no party, no guests to impress. Vivienne cooked, actually cooked, not catered, and while the pasta was slightly overcooked and the salad dressing was too vinegary, it was clear she'd tried. That mattered more than perfect execution. We sat on their terrace as the sun set, painting the Charleston sky in shades of amber and rose, and David raised his glass. "I want to make a toast," he said. "To Mom. To the woman who taught me everything about resilience and determination, even though I was too blind to see it for a long time. To the woman who built an empire when everyone doubted her. To the woman who showed me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. And to forgiveness," Vivienne added softly. "To second chances and to women who refuse to stay small no matter how much the world tries to shrink them." We clinked glasses, and I felt something shift inside me, a final release of the anger I'd been carrying for so long. I looked at my son, healthy and whole and finally seeing me for who I really was. I looked at my daughter-in-law, who'd become an unlikely student and, even more unlikely, a friend. And I looked at this house they'd bought to impress people, that was slowly transforming into an actual home as they learned what really mattered. "Can I tell you something?" I said. 5 years ago, when Vivienne made that comment about my house, when you all laughed and I drove home crying, I thought my life was over. I thought I was just going to fade into irrelevance, become one of those sad old women who lives in the past and has nothing to show for her present. I paused, remembering that night, the weight of despair that had settled over me. But that night broke something open in me. It showed me that I'd been living for everyone else's approval. Yours, David, and by extension, Vivienne's, and everyone else who I thought was keeping score of my worth. And when I realized I'd never earned that approval by being small and quiet and grateful, something inside me said, then stop trying. Build something for yourself. Prove to yourself that you matter. "And you did," David said quietly. "God, Mom, you really did." I did. But here's what I learned along the way. Revenge is a hell of a motivator at first. It gets you out of bed, it pushes you through the hard days, it keeps you going when you want to quit. But eventually, you have to find something else to work for. Because revenge will eat you alive if you let it. It'll make you hard and bitter and isolated, even when you're successful. I looked at both of them. I'm grateful for what happened, as strange as that sounds. Because it forced me to grow in ways I never would have otherwise. But I'm even more grateful for what's happening now. For this. For us learning how to be a family again, a better family than we were before. Vivienne wiped at her eyes. I spent so much time trying to pull David away from his past, from where he came from. I thought I was helping him move forward. But I was really just cutting him off from his roots. From you. And in the process, I was cutting him off from the best parts of himself. The parts that came from being raised by someone as strong and determined as you. "We're all learning," I said. "I'm learning that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. You're learning that appearances aren't everything. David's learning that you can honor where you came from while still building something new. We're all works in progress." David reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you, Mom. Really see you. Not just as my mother, but as Patricia Morrison, badass entrepreneur and the strongest person I know." "Language," I said automatically, then laughed. "Old habits." We spent the rest of the evening talking and laughing, sharing stories and making plans. Vivienne told us about her first client for her design business, a nervous first-time property owner who'd hired her based on a recommendation from Ashley. David told us about a promotion he'd gotten at work, one he'd been hesitant to mention because he didn't want to seem like he was bragging given how distant we'd been. And I told them about my latest project, not another property, but a mentorship program I was developing to help other women over 60 who wanted to start businesses. I'd been contacted by so many people after my magazine features, women who felt stuck or invisible or like it was too late for them to try something new. I wanted to help them the way Raymond and Jolene and Hector had helped me. I wanted to pay forward the support I'd received. "That's perfect," Vivienne said. "You should partner with the community college. They have adult education programs that would be a great fit." "I could help with the business planning curriculum," David offered. "Financial projections, risk assessment, all the boring spreadsheet stuff." "And I could talk about the creative side," Vivienne added. "Branding, marketing, making your business stand out." I looked at them, this family I'd almost lost, now offering to help me build something new. And I realized this was what I'd been working toward all along, even when I didn't know it. Not just success in business, but connection. Not just proving my worth, but sharing it. Not just building an empire, but building something meaningful that could help others. I'd love that, I said. I'd love all of that. As I drove home that night, back to my little vinyl-sided house that I'd never sell because it was where I learned that home isn't about impressing people. It's about the memories you make and the person you become within its walls. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago. She'd been scared. She'd been hurt. She'd been desperate for validation from people who couldn't see her value. But she'd also been brave enough to take a risk, to bet on herself when no one else would, to build something from nothing because she refused to accept that her best days were behind her. I thought about Vivian's words that night, the ones Kelsey had shared with me. I doubt if this house was not built for the birds. This below my standard. Those words had stung so much because part of me had believed them. Part of me had thought maybe she was right, maybe I was small and insignificant and beneath the notice of successful people like her. But I'd taken that pain and transformed it into something powerful. I'd proved, not to her, but to myself, that my standard was the only one that mattered. That my life had value not because of how it looked from the outside, but because of what I'd built with determination and vision and refusal to give up. And now, 5 years later, that same woman who'd mocked my house was learning from me. That same son who'd stayed silent while I was dismissed was proudly calling me a badass entrepreneur. That same family that had felt irreparably broken was healing, slowly and imperfectly, but healing nonetheless. Life is funny that way. The things that break you can also remake you, if you let them. The people who hurt you can sometimes become the ones who help you grow, if everyone's willing to do the work. And the dreams you build out of spite and anger can transform into something more meaningful. Something built on purpose and passion and the genuine desire to make a difference. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a moment, looking at my house. It wasn't fancy. It would never make anyone's list of impressive homes or architectural marvels. But it was mine, and it was where my story had started, and it was still standing, just like me. I walked inside, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. I had emails to answer, bookings to confirm, a mentorship program to develop. I had work to do, purpose to pursue, a life to live that was full and rich and entirely my own. And somewhere in the city, in a grand house with a terrace and gas lanterns and everything money could buy, my son and daughter-in-law were learning that the best things in life can't be purchased or inherited. They have to be earned through struggle and growth and the willingness to admit when you're wrong and do better. 5 years ago, I thought revenge was what I wanted. I thought proving them wrong would be enough. But what I found was something better. I found myself. I found my strength, my capability, my worth, not in relation to anyone else, but as an absolute truth that existed regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. And that, I've learned, is the sweetest victory of all. Not making others see your value, but knowing it so deeply yourself that their opinions become irrelevant. Not building an empire to prove you're somebody, but building it because you already know you are. If you're watching this and you're at that breaking point, that moment where someone's made you feel small or insignificant or like your best days are behind you, I want you to hear me, they're wrong. You are capable of more than you imagine. You are stronger than you know. And it is never, ever too late to build the life you deserve. Take the pain they gave you and transform it into power. Take the doubt and turn it into determination. Take the mockery and make it into motivation. But then, and this is crucial, let it go. Let the anger fuel you at first, but don't let it define you. Build something beautiful not because you want to prove them wrong, but because you deserve beautiful things. Because you deserve to take up space and matter and be seen. And when you do, when you've built your empire or started your business or simply learned to value yourself despite what others think, don't forget to come back and help the next person. Share what you learned. Offer the support you wished you'd had. Be the mentor, the friend, the voice that says, you can do this, and I believe in you. That's what I'm doing now. That's what my empire is really about, not properties or profit margins, but possibility. The possibility that it's never too late, that you're never too old, that past mistakes or missed opportunities don't define your future. The possibility that you can start over at 60 or 70 or 80 and build something remarkable. The possibility that who you are matters more than what you have, and that your worth doesn't depend on anyone's approval but your own. My name is Patricia Morrison. I'm 70 years old. I'm a mother, a grandmother-to-be, yes, Vivian's pregnant, and I couldn't be more thrilled, a business owner, and a mentor. I'm a woman who was mocked and dismissed and told she was below someone's standard. And I'm a woman who took that pain and built an empire. But more than any of that, I'm a woman who learned that the most important empire you can build is the one inside yourself. The knowledge of your own worth, the confidence in your own capabilities, the unshakable belief that you deserve to take up space in this world. That's the empire that no one can take from you. That's the standard that really matters. And that's the victory that endures long after the revenge has faded and the anger has cooled, and all that's left is the life you built and the person you became in the process. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, if it gave you hope or motivation, or just reminded you that you're not alone in feeling underestimated or overlooked, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And please, check the description box below for more stories like this. Stories about women who refused to stay small, who bet on themselves when no one else would, who built empires out of heartbreak and came out stronger on the other side. Your story isn't over. Not even close. The best chapters might still be ahead of you, waiting to be written. All you have to do is pick up the pen and refuse to let anyone else decide how your story ends. Now go build your empire. Whatever that looks like for you. And when you do, remember the woman in Charleston who started at 63 with nothing but anger and determination, and ended up with something far more valuable than revenge. Herself, fully realized and unapologetically present. That's my story. What's yours going to be?